Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey not of action and intrigue, but of gentle descent into the past, designed to quiet your mind and ease you into a peaceful slumber. Tonight, we drift back to a time of rugged ambition and unforgiving landscapes, a period etched into the annals of human endeavor, yet often shrouded in the noisy clamor of adventure. We're going to explore the quiet, yet profoundly perilous lives of the ordinary men who chased dreams of fortune during the great gold rushes of history. Forget the dramatic shootouts and the sudden strikes of glittering wealth that so often dominate the romanticized tales. Tonight, we will delve into the monotonous, backbreaking reality of the gold miner, the relentless sun, the biting cold, the constant dampness, the ever-present threat of disease, and the sheer, mind-numbing repetition of their daily toil. This isn't a story of heroes, but of endurance, not of grand victories, but of countless small struggles against nature, against luck, and often against themselves. The journey to the gold fields did not begin with a shovel in the dirt. It began with a walk that seemed to have no end. For the thousands who flocked to California in 1849, or the Klondike in 1897, the first peril was simply the distance between the life they knew and the dream they sought. This was a distance measured not in miles, but in the slow, rhythmic cadence of footsteps on dry earth, or the heavy trudge through knee-deep mud. Imagine, if you will, the sheer monotony of the trail. The landscape, while vast and often beautiful, became a blurred backdrop to the singular task of moving forward. Day after day, the sun rose over a horizon that looked remarkably like the one from the day before and the day before that. The primary mode of transport for the overland miner was the wagon, typically pulled by oxen or mules. These animals were not the swift steeds of legend, but slow, deliberate creatures that moved at a pace of perhaps 2 miles per hour. A miner would often walk alongside the wagon to spare the animals the extra weight, his boots slowly disintegrating against the abrasive grit of the trail. The sound of the journey was the constant rhythmic creaking of wooden wheels, the occasional crack of a whip, and the low mournful lowing of the oxen. This soundscape, repeated for months on end, became the heartbeat of their existence. It was a rhythm that could lull a man into a trance-like state, a mental fog where the only reality was the next step, the next watering hole, the next camp. As the sun climbed higher, the heat would become a physical weight. The dust, kicked up by thousands of hooves and wheels, hung in the air like a thick, golden veil. It coated everything: the miner's skin, their clothes, their food, and their lungs. They breathed the trail, tasted it, and wore it as a second skin. To wash was a luxury seldom afforded, as water was a precious commodity, often brackish and warm by the time it reached a thirsty throat. The peril here was not a sudden catastrophe, but the slow erosion of the body and the spirit. Dehydration was a constant shadow, a quiet thief that sapped the strength and clouded the mind long before the miner ever saw a glint of gold in a pan. The nights offered a brief respite, but they brought their own brand of weary routine. As the light faded, the wagons would be circled, a practice as much for organization as for protection. The ritual of the evening camp was a study in efficiency born of exhaustion. Fires were lit, using whatever fuel could be scavenged, often dry sagebrush, or, more commonly, dried buffalo chips, which burned with a low, steady heat and a surprisingly unobtrusive smell. The evening meal was a repetitive affair: salt, pork, hardtack, and perhaps a pot of beans that had been soaking in a bucket hanging from the wagon all day. There was little conversation. The day's toil had drained the energy for talk. Men ate in silence, their eyes fixed on the flickering flames, their minds perhaps wandering back to the homes and families they had left behind. The silence of the wilderness was profound. Away from the immediate sounds of the camp, the world was vast and indifferent. The stars, unpolluted by the lights of civilization, burned with a cold, piercing intensity. To a miner lying on the hard ground, wrapped in a thin blanket, the scale of the universe must have felt overwhelming. The peril of the trail was often found in this psychological weight, the realization of one's own insignificance in the face of such immense, untamed space. It was a loneliness that could settle into the bones as deeply as the cold of the desert night. Transitioning from the heat of the plains to the ascent of the mountains introduced a new, more immediate kind of danger. The gentle incline of the prairie gave way to steep, rocky passes where the wagons had to be dismantled and hauled up by hand using ropes and pulleys. Here, the physical strain reached its peak. A single slip of a foot, a frayed rope, or a panicked animal could lead to a disaster that ruined months of progress. The air grew thinner, making every breath a conscious effort. The temperature could drop precipitously, turning a sweat-soaked shirt into a frigid shroud within minutes. For those heading to the Klondike, the walk involved the infamous Chilkoot Pass. Picture a literal staircase of ice carved into the side of a mountain. Each man was required by the Canadian authorities to bring a year's worth of supplies, a ton of goods, to prevent starvation in the remote north. This meant that each miner had to make dozens of trips up the pass, carrying 60 to 80 pounds at a time, then sliding back down to start again. It was a repetitive, soul-crushing cycle of ascent and descent, performed in a landscape of blinding white snow and biting wind. The Golden Staircase, as it was mockingly called, was a place where many men simply sat down and wept, the weight of their ambition finally proving too heavy to bear. Yet, despite the hardship, there was a strange, meditative quality to this long walk. The mind, stripped of the complexities of social life, focused on the most basic of needs: food, water, rest, and movement. There was a peculiar peace in the simplicity of the goal. The peril was everywhere, but so was the singular focus of the journey. The miners were moving toward a promise, a shimmering idea that lay just over the next ridge. This hope was the fuel that kept the oxen moving and the boots treading the dust. In this first stage of the gold rush experience, we see the foundation of the miner's life: endurance. It was not the flash of the pan that defined them, but the thousands of miles of grit and silence that led them there. As you imagine these long lines of wagons and men stretching across the horizon, let the slow, steady pace of their journey settle your own thoughts. The road is long, the pace is slow, and the world is very, very quiet. Once the long walk ended, the miner faced a new, stationary peril: the construction of a life out of nothing. Arriving at a strike did not mean finding a hotel or even a stable town. It meant finding a patch of dirt and claiming it. The first days at a new digging site were a frantic, yet strangely rhythmic scramble to establish a foothold against the elements. These early camps were not the bustling wooden towns seen in later photographs. They were fragile, temporary clusters of canvas and bark that offered only the thinnest veil of protection between a man and the wild. The architecture of the gold rush began with the tent, to the modern ear, A tent sounds like a summer luxury, but for the miner it was a humid, cramped universe. These were often made of heavy, oil-soaked canvas that smelled of turpentine and old sweat. In the California heat, they became suffocating ovens, trapping the stagnant air and the buzzing flies that followed the pack animals. In the rains of the Sierra foothills or the damp valleys of the Australian bush, the canvas would eventually saturate, leading to a constant, rhythmic dripping of cold water onto blankets and tools. The sound of rain on canvases, steady, dull thudding, became the soundtrack to many a sleepless night, a reminder that the world outside was slowly turning to liquid. As the weeks turned into months, those who stayed began to improve their dwellings, though the word improvement is used loosely. A miner might build a dugout, carving a hole into the side of a hill and roofing it with logs and sod. These structures were cool in the summer and warm in the winter, but they were perpetually damp. The walls would weep moisture, and the scent of wet earth was omnipresent. It was a life lived underground before the mining even began. Others built crude cabins of unhewn logs, the gaps stuffed with mud and moss, a process called chinking. As the mud dried, it would crack and fall out, letting in the biting wind or the curious local wildlife. These cabins were less like homes and more like wooden cages, designed to keep the occupant just dry enough to return to the river the next morning. The floor of these dwellings was almost always the bare earth. Over time, the constant treading of heavy boots would pack the dirt into a hard, dusty surface that was impossible to keep clean. Everything the miner owned, his spare shirt, his heavy wool coat, his precious bag of flour, was perpetually coated in a fine layer of silt. This dust was a silent intruder, finding its way into every crevice and every meal. It was the physical manifestation of the landscape's refusal to be tamed. The peril here was the slow degradation of hygiene. In these cramped, muddy quarters, the line between the inside and the outside blurred until a man felt as though he were part of the geology itself. The camp layout followed no plan other than the path of least resistance. Tents and shacks were huddled together near the water source, creating a maze of narrow, winding footpaths that turned into quagmires of thick, boot-sucking mud at the first sign of rain. There were no drainage systems, no waste disposal, and no sense of order. The air in a developing camp was a thick soup of wood smoke from hundreds of small fires, the pungent aroma of drying mule tack, and the heavy, sweet scent of rotting organic matter. For a man used to the orderly streets of a village in New England or a town in Cornwall, the sensory assault of the mining camp was a profound shock to the system. In this environment, the peril of the camp was often the lack of privacy. A man was never truly alone. The thin walls of canvas or the gaps in the log cabins meant that every cough, every groan of exhaustion, and every muttered prayer from a neighbor was audible. The camp was a collective of individuals, yet it was a space of forced intimacy. This constant proximity to others, combined with the crushing weight of the labor, created a strange psychological tension. Men became hypersensitive to the sounds of their environments, the clink of a shovel, the splash of a boot in the mud, the distant rumble of a falling tree. Every sound was a signal, a piece of information to be processed by a tired brain. The focal point of every cabin or tent was the hearth or the small sheet-iron stove. This was the only source of light and warmth, and it was where the miner performed his most essential daily task, cooking. The kitchen was usually a single blackened pot and a frying pan. The ritual of the evening meal was a slow, meditative process. A man would sit on a stump or a crate, staring into the embers as his salt pork sizzled and popped. The smoke from the fire would sting his eyes and cling to his hair, but it was a comfort against the encroaching darkness of the surrounding forest. The fire provided a small circle of safety, a tiny kingdom of light in a vast and unpredictable wilderness. Furniture was a rare luxury. A bed was often nothing more than a Rocky Mountain transformer, a frame of poles with a piece of canvas stretched across it, or perhaps a pile of pine boughs covered with a single, itchy wool blanket. To sleep on pine boughs is to be constantly poked by needles and to smell the sharp, resinous scent of the forest as you drift off. It was a bed that reminded you of where you were with every movement. A table might be a flat-topped stump. A chair was often a discarded crate. These rough-hewn objects reflected the transience of the life. Nothing was built to last. Everything was designed to be abandoned the moment the gold ran out. As you picture these early camps, imagine the flicking lanterns and the low hum of hundreds of men settling in for the night. The camps were fragile islands of human presence in a sea of ancient trees and silent mountains. The peril was not just the disease that festered in the mud or the fire that could level a canvas town in minutes. It was the sheer grinding effort required to maintain a shred of human dignity in a place that seemed to demand only labor. The miners were building a world, one muddy footprint at a time, but it was a world that felt as though it might wash away with the next heavy dew. Let the image of the flickering firelight and the sound of the wind sighing through the gaps in the log walls lead you toward a quiet, heavy rest. The camp is still, the fires are low, and the mountain air is cool and deep. The sun had not yet crested the ridges of the Sierra Nevada or the frozen peaks of the Yukon when the miners' day began. There was no alarm clock, only the internal ticking of a body pushed to its limit and the cold, gray light of dawn filtering through canvas or logs. The transition from sleep to work was abrupt and unforgiving. A miner would pull on boots that were often still damp from the day before leather that had stiffened into a rigid, unforgiving mold overnight. The first steps of the morning were a painful negotiation between blistered feet and cold, wet leather. This was the start of the long day, a period of 12 to 14 hours, where the primary goal was to move as much of the Earth's crust as humanly possible. To understand the peril of this work, one must understand its utter lack of variety. The most basic tool was the gold pan, a shallow, circular dish of iron or tin. Panning was not a casual hobby. It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing exercise in physics. A miner would crouch by the icy edge of a stream, his knees deep in the mud, and fill the pan with heavy gravel. Then came the motion, a gentle, swirling rotation under the water, followed by a slight tilt to let the lighter sand wash over the rim. This motion had to be perfectly calibrated. Too much force, and the gold would wash away with the silt. Too little, and the pan would remain choked with useless debris. After 5 minutes of swirling, the miner would find perhaps a few specks of color, or, more often, nothing but black sand. Then he would stand, his back protesting the sudden change in posture, and begin the process again, thousands of times, day after day. The peril of the pan was the miner's back, a chronic, aching soreness that eventually became a permanent part of a man's identity. The constant crouching and leaning over water sources led to a stooped gait that many carried for the rest of their lives. But as the surface gold disappeared, the tools became more complex and the labor more intensive. Enter the cradle, or the rocker box. This was a wooden contraption that looked remarkably like a child's crib, but its purpose was far from soothing. One man would shovel dirt into a sieve at the top, while another rocked the box back and forth with a handle while pouring water over the earth. The sound of the rocker was a constant, heavy thud-clack that echoed through the canyons. It was a hypnotic, mechanical rhythm that dictated the pace of the entire camp. To operate the rocker was to be a human machine. The arm moving the handle would grow numb, the shoulder would burn, and the eyes would become glazed as they watched the muddy slurry disappear through the slats. The peril here was a mental one, the sheer, mind-numbing repetition. In the silence of the wilderness, the thud-clack of the rocker was the only heartbeat that mattered. It was a sound that followed the miners into their dreams, a rhythmic ghost that never truly left them. By midday, the heat or the cold, depending on the region, would become an adversary. In the California gulches, the sun would reflect off the water and the pale rocks, creating a shimmering heat that could lead to sunstroke. The water in the streams, however, remained transitionally icy, fed by mountain snowmelt. A miner lived in a state of thermal contradiction. His upper body was scorching and sun-reddened, while his legs, submerged in the stream, were numb and blue with cold. This constant internal battle often led to rheumatism, a catch-all term for the joint pain and stiffness caused by perpetual exposure to damp and cold. The long day was also a battle against the very material they sought. Gold is heavy, 19 times denser than water, and it hides in the most difficult places. Miners had to move tons of overburden, the useless dirt and rocks on top, to reach the pay dirt near the bedrock. This meant wielding a heavy pickaxe for hours on end. The sound of steel hitting stone, a sharp, ringing ping, was the punctuation mark of the afternoon. Each swing of the pick sent a jolt through the wrists, the elbows, and the shoulders. A misplaced swing could shatter a shin or crush a toe, and in a world without hospitals, such an injury was often a death sentence or a permanent ticket to poverty. As the afternoon stretched on, the physical exhaustion reached a plateau. The body moved on instinct. The miners would work in a state of gold fever, a psychological state where the hope of a strike acted as a biological stimulant, masking the pain of the muscles. But the fever had a dark side. It led to the neglect of basic needs. A man might forget to drink water or ignore the growing infection in a cut on his hand caused by jagged quartz. The environment was filled with bacteria that thrived in the warm, stagnant pools near the diggings. A minor scratch, constantly irritated by grit and dirty water, could turn into a mountain sore that refused to heal, eventually leading to blood poisoning. The end of the working day didn't come when the work was done. The work was never done but when the light failed. As the shadows lengthened across the valley, the miners would conduct the cleanup. This was the most delicate part of the day, where the concentrated sand from the riffles of the sluice or the bottom of the rocker was carefully panned down to see what the day's toil had yielded. This was the moment of truth. For many, the result was a pinch of gold dust, barely enough to cover the cost of the day's salt pork and beans. The psychological peril of the long day was this moment, the realization that 12 hours of back-breaking labor had resulted in almost nothing. The walk back to the tent or cabin was a slow, stumbling procession of shadows. The tools were left by the water, heavy and cold. The miners were played out, a term they used for both a depleted gold mine and a depleted human being. Their clothes were caked in dried mud that cracked as they moved, sounding like rustling parchment. Their hands were swollen, the skin pickled and white from hours in the water, the palms calloused into hard yellow horns. Tonight, as you rest, imagine that rhythmic thud-clack of the rocker box fading into the distance. The picks have stopped their ringing, and the shovels are resting against the stones. The long day is over. The heavy, muddy boots have been kicked off, and the silence of the evening is finally allowed to settle over the tired earth. The labor was immense, but the night is long, and the rest is finally here. Let the steady, unhurried memory of that repetitive work act as a weight that pulls you down into a deep, dreamless sleep. In the modern world, we often think of a meal as a moment of pleasure or a social gathering. For the gold rush miner, food was a purely mechanical necessity, fuel for a machine that was rapidly breaking down. The perils of the plate were not found in the flavor, for there was very little of that, but in the nutritional void and the biological dangers lurking in every swallow. The miner's diet was a study in beige, salt, pork, flour, beans, and coffee. This was a monotonous cycle of sustenance that offered plenty of calories but almost none of the vitamins required to keep a human body functioning in such a hostile environment. The cornerstone of the miner's diet was salt pork, often referred to as sowbelly. This was pork that had been cured in heavy brine and packed into barrels for transport over thousands of miles. By the time it reached a remote mining camp, it was often several years old. To prepare it, a miner would hack off a slab, which was frequently yellowed with age and translucent with fat. The salt content was so high that the meat had to be boiled multiple times just to make it edible. And even then, it remained a chewy, briny ordeal. The peril here was twofold. The excessive sodium led to chronic dehydration, and the lack of proper refrigeration meant that tainted meat was a common occurrence. A miner might find himself plagued by stomach cramps and the flux's dysentery, a condition that claimed more lives in the gold fields than any mountain lion or mining accident ever did. Then there was the hard bread or hardtack. These were thick, dry crackers made of flour and water, baked until they were as hard as the stones in the creek bed. Hardtack was designed to be indestructible, and it largely succeeded. To eat it without breaking a tooth, a miner had to soak it in coffee or fry it in the rendered fat of his salt pork. But hardtack had a silent inhabitant, the weevil. It was a common sight to see a miner tapping his cracker against the edge of a crate to shake out the small, dark beetles before taking a bite. Some simply ate them, figuring the insects provided a rare, albeit unwanted, source of protein. This was the reality of the Plata constant negotiation with decay. The beverage of choice was coffee, brewed so strong it could likely dissolve a copper coin. It was often made from beans that were roasted until they were charcoal black over a smoky campfire, then crushed with a hammer or the butt of a pistol. This coffee was not a luxury. It was a stimulant used to mask the overwhelming fatigue of the long day. It was often drunk without sugar or milk, a bitter, hot liquid that offered a temporary jolt of energy followed by a long, jittery crash. The caffeine, combined with the lack of water, kept the miners in a state of perpetual physiological stress. Perhaps the most insidious peril of the gold rush diet was the silent killer, scurvy. Because fresh fruits and vegetables were almost impossible to find in remote gulches, and prohibitively expensive if they were available. Miners suffered from a severe lack of vitamin C. The symptoms of scurvy were like something out of a Gothic horror novel. First came a profound, bone-deep lethargy. Then the gums would swell and bleed, and old scars from years' past injuries would mysteriously reopen. Teeth would loosen in their sockets, and the skin would bruise at the slightest touch. The irony was palpable. Men were surrounded by mountains of wealth, but were literally falling apart for the lack of a single potato or an onion. In some camps, a lucky miner might find wild onions or miner's lettuce, Claytonia perfoliata, a small, fleshy green that grew near the streams. These were consumed with a desperation that bordered on religious fervor. When a shipment of potatoes or lemons finally reached a starving camp, they were sold for their weight in gold. There are historical accounts of miners paying a full ounce of gold weeks of back-breaking labor for a single shriveled onion. This was the price of survival. The plate was a gamble. Every meal was a reminder of what the body was missing. The act of cooking itself was a chore that few had the energy to perform properly after 14 hours in the mud. Most meals were one-pot affairs. A handful of beans, which had been soaking in a bucket all day, would be thrown into a pot with some salt pork and boiled until they were soft enough to swallow. This slop was eaten in the dim light of a tallow candle or the dying embers of a fire. There were no plates in the traditional sense. A tin cup and a dull knife were often the only utensils. The sound of the meal was the scrape of metal on tin and the heavy, rhythmic chewing of men who were too tired to talk. As the miners sat in the shadows of their tents, the lack of nutrition began to take its toll on their minds as well as their bodies. Nutritional deficiencies can lead to irritability, depression, and cabin fever. The monotony of the food mirrored the monotony of the landscape and the labor. It was a cycle of dullness that wore down the spirit. The dream of gold was often replaced by a much simpler dream, a crust of fresh bread, a crisp apple, or a glass of cold, clean milk. These were the true treasures of the world they had left behind. Tonight, as you drift off, think of the simplicity of a quiet, warm kitchen. Contrast that with the flickering, smoky reality of a miner's camp. Let the image of that heavy salt pork stew bubbling over a low fire be a symbol of the endurance required just to stay alive. The fires are being banked now. The tin cups are set aside, and the hunger is momentarily stilled by the heavy, leaden sleep of the exhausted. The world is dark, the air is cool, and the belly is finally quiet. In the romanticized tales of the goldfields, the threats are always visible: a crumbling mine shaft, a rushing river, or a predatory animal. But the most relentless predators in the mining camps were invisible. Bacteria and viruses thrived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions that the miners called home. In a world before the germ theory of disease was widely understood or practiced, a simple drink of water or a minor scrape could become a death sentence. The invisible enemies were the silent partners of every mining claim, and the medicine used to combat them was often as perilous as the ailments themselves. The primary culprit was the water. While it looked crystal clear as it tumbled over the mountain rocks, it was often a carrier for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Mining camps were rarely built with an eye toward sanitation. Human waste and animal refuse frequently washed into the very same streams where men drank and washed their gold. Cholera, in particular, was the terror of the trails and the camps. It was a swift, capable of taking a healthy man from his morning coffee to his grave before the sun set. The sound of the camp during a cholera outbreak was not the ringing of picks, but the low, rhythmic groaning of the sick and the hurried digging of shallow graves in the rocky soil. The psychological peril of disease was the sense of helplessness. Miners were men of action, used to fighting the earth with their hands, but they had no defense against a foe they couldn't see. When a man fell ill, his messmates, the men he worked and lived with, faced a grim choice. They could stop work to care for him, risking their own meager savings and their health, or they could leave him to the mercy of the doctors who frequented the camps. These doctors were often charlatans, men who had failed at mining and decided that selling elixirs was a more profitable venture. Their pharmacopoeia was a nightmare of heavy metals and toxins. Mercury, arsenic, and lead were common ingredients in blue pills intended to purify the blood. One of the most common treatments was bleeding, a holdover from medieval medical theory. If a man was flushed with fever, the doctor might open a vein to let out the excess blood. In a body already weakened by scurvy, hard labor, and poor nutrition, this loss of blood was often the final blow. There was also the frequent use of laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol. While it provided a temporary, hazy escape from pain, it was highly addictive and led many miners into a spiral of dependency that left them played out long before their claims were exhausted. The medicine of the gold rush was less about healing and more about managing the agony of a body that was being used up by the landscape. Then there were the mountain fevers, a vague category that covered everything from malaria to tick-borne illnesses. In the damp heat of the California summer or the humid Australian bush, mosquitoes were an incessant, buzzing plague. Miners would sleep with their heads covered by blankets, despite the stifling heat, just to escape the biting. The resulting fevers brought vivid, terrifying hallucinations. A miner might spend days in a shivering delirium, dreaming of mountains of gold that turned into piles of skulls as he reached for them. The silence of the night was often broken by these fever dreams, the muttered ramblings of men lost in the internal wilderness of their own failing health. Dental health was another silent agony. The perils of the plate we discussed earlier, the hardtack, and the lack of vitamin C wreaked havoc on the miner's teeth. Without dentists, the only remedy for a rotted tooth was extraction, often performed by a blacksmith with a pair of pliers. There was no anesthesia, perhaps only a heavy swig of rot-gut whiskey to dull the senses. The memory of that sharp, bone-cracking sound would linger in a man's mind for years. It was a visceral reminder that in the goldfields, the body was a depreciating asset, being traded away piece by piece for the hope of a fortune. The environment itself conspired to keep wounds open. Miners' scurvy caused skin to become thin and papery, and the constant exposure to alkaline dust and muddy water meant that even a small blister from a shovel handle could turn into a suppurating mountain sore. These sores were a common side-frangry red inflammations that miners would wrap in greasy rags. They would try to draw out the poison with poultices made of tobacco juice, pine, resin, or even warm mud. These folk remedies occasionally worked, but more often they simply introduced new bacteria into the wound. The smell of a mining camp was not just wood smoke and sweat. It was the sickly sweet scent of infection and the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies. Despite this, there was a strange, stoic camaraderie in the face of illness. Men who were strangers months before would find themselves acting as nurses, feeding a sick companion spoonfuls of weak broth or sitting by their side through the long, dark hours of a fever. This was the higher law of the diggings, the unspoken agreement that no man should have to face the invisible enemies alone. It was a quiet, desperate kind of heroism, practiced in the shadows of the tents, far from the glory of the gold pan. As you settle into the safety of your own bed, feel the immense comfort of your health and the cleanliness of your surroundings. The invisible enemies of the past have no place here. The air is clear, the water is pure, and the night is a time of healing, not of fever. Imagine the cool, soothing darkness washing over those tired historical figures, quieting their aches and stilling their labored breaths. The camp is silent now. The doctors have moved on, and the only sound is the gentle, rhythmic sighing of the wind through the pines. As the easy gold the dust and small nuggets found in the surface gravel of the riverbeds began to vanish, the miners were forced to follow the gold to its source. This transition marked a shift from the rhythmic swirling of the pan to the claustrophobic, vertical world of shaft mining. The peril moved from the open air of the riverbank into the crushing weight of the earth itself. To go deep was to enter a realm where the sun never reached, where the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient rot, and where the only thing standing between a man and 1,000 tons of mountain was a few hastily hewn timbers. The construction of a coyote hole or a small shaft was an exercise in primitive engineering and immense bravery. A miner would dig a vertical hole barely wider than his own shoulders and descend into the darkness. The methods were rudimentary. A windlass, which was essentially a wooden drum with a crank and a rope, was positioned over the hole. One partner would stand at the top, cranking the handle to lower a bucket or a man, while the other worked at the bottom. The sound of this work was the rhythmic, hollow thud of a pick against bedrock and the creak of the wooden windlass. In the deep, every sound was amplified. A small pebble falling from the top of the shaft sounded like a gunshot. A distant groan of settling earth sounded like the world coming to an end. The most immediate peril of the deep was bad air. As a shaft descended further into the earth, the oxygen supply would dwindle, replaced by damp, various gases like carbon dioxide or methane that could settle in the low points of a tunnel. Without modern ventilation systems, miners relied on windsails, long tubes of canvas designed to catch the breeze at the surface and funnel it down into the hole. But on a still day, when the air was heavy and the wind refused to blow, a miner might find himself slipping into a peaceful, deadly lethargy. This was a quiet peril. There was no pain, only a sudden, overwhelming desire to sleep. Many a miner was found at the bottom of his shaft, his shovel still in his hand, looking as though he had simply decided to take a nap in the cool dark. Then there was the constant threat of a cave-in. The earth is not a solid, static mass. It is a living thing, full of shifting faults, hidden water pockets, and layers of loose shale. To keep the tunnel from collapsing, miners used timbering, propping up the ceiling with logs cut from the nearby forest. However, timber was expensive and time-consuming to install. In their haste to reach the pay streak, many miners skimped on their supports. They lived with the creak and the groan. Wood, under immense pressure, speaks. It pops and splinters, giving a rhythmic warning that the mountain is trying to reclaim the space. A seasoned miner learned to listen to the timbering as if it were a heartbeat. If the talking of the wood grew too loud, it was time to drop the tools and scramble for the surface. Water was another subterranean enemy. Deep shafts often acted as natural wells, collecting the groundwater that seeped through the porous rock. A miner might spend half his day bailing, hauling up buckets of freezing, muddy water just to keep his feet clear. The dampness was pervasive. It soaked through clothes, rusted tools, and turned the floor of the tunnel into a slick, treacherous slide. Working in a flooded shaft led to trenchfoot and intensified the bone-deep chill that no amount of heavy wool could repel. The sound of the deep was the constant, rhythmic drip of water from the ceiling. A clock that measured the slow progress of the day in droplets of ice. Blasting introduced a more violent peril to the deep. When the pick and shovel could no longer penetrate the hard quartz, miners turned to black powder. This was a delicate and terrifying process. A hole was drilled into the rock face, filled with powder, and a fuse was lit. The miner then had a frantic, heart-pounding minute to climb the ladder or be hauled up by the windlass before the explosion. The misfire was the greatest fear of fuse that went out or burned too slowly. A man would have to decide when it was safe to go back down and check the charge. Many miners lost their sight, their limbs, or their lives to a blast that waited until they were inches away before finally detonating. Despite the danger, the deep held a strange, quiet attraction. Down in the earth, the world above the heat, the flies, the noise of the camp vanished. It was a place of singular focus. It was just the man, the candle, and the stone. There was a rhythmic peace to the work of the pick, a steady tink that resonated through the bones. It was a meditative labor, performed in a cathedral of ancient rock. The peril was the price of admission to this hidden world, a world where a single swing of the tool could reveal a vein of gold that changed everything. Tonight, as you lie in the safety of your room, feel the immense weight of the ceiling above you, not as a threat, but as a sturdy, reliable shield. The air you breathe is fresh and abundant. The light is steady and warm. Imagine the silence of the deep earth, not as a place of danger, but as a cool, quiet sanctuary where the sounds of the world are muffled and distant. Let the image of the flickering miner's candle slowly fade, replaced by the soft, dark velvet of a restful night. The mountain is still, the tunnels are empty, and the earth is at peace. As we move away from the physical dangers of the rock and the river, we must consider the more subtle, psychological perils that eroded the spirit of the gold rush miner. The social fabric of a mining camp was a fragile thing, woven from the threads of thousands of individual ambitions, yet lacking the sturdy looms of family, tradition, and established law. In the early days of a strike, there were no police, no courts, and no governing bodies. There was only the common law of the diggings, a rough and ready set of rules that prioritized property over personhood and relied on the collective will of a tired, often irritable population. The peril here was not a falling rock, but the isolation of the soul and the sudden unpredictable violence of a society without a safety net. Imagine the profound isolation that defined the miner's existence. Most of these men had left behind wives, children, parents, and sisters, the very people who anchored them to their humanity. In the wilderness, they were men without women, living in a world of rough edges and coarse language. The letters from home were the only lifeline, yet they often took months to arrive, carried by ship and mule across continents. A miner might spend his evening by a dying fire, reading a 3-month-old letter until the paper was soft and transparent from the grease of his fingers. The silence that followed the reading was a peril of its own, a deep, hollow longing that could lead to cabin fever or a desperate, melancholy withdrawal from the world. Because the social structure was so thin, the mining claim became the only thing that mattered. A man's claim was his identity, his bank account, and his future. To jump a claim to take over a plot of land that someone else had already marked was considered the ultimate sin. In the absence of a sheriff, justice was handled by miners' courts. These were impromptu gatherings where the entire camp would drop their shovels and assemble to act as judge, jury, and executioner. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of unwashed wool. There were no lawyers and no appeals. A man accused of theft or claim jumping might find himself tried, convicted, and whipped or worse with in the span of a single afternoon. The peril of the social fabric was this lack of due process. A misunderstanding or a false accusation could end a life with terrifying speed. The lack of traditional social outlets meant that recreation was often as perilous as the work itself. When the sun went down or the rains made mining impossible, the men gravitated toward the only communal spaces available, the gambling halls and the saloons. These were often nothing more than large tents with a plank of wood over 2 barrels for a bar. Here, the rot-gut whiskey, often a lethal concoction of grain alcohol, tobacco juice, and red pepper, flowed freely. The sound of the camp changed from the rhythmic thud of the rocker to the clatter of dice, the shuffling of cards, and the increasingly loud, aggressive voices of men who had spent too much time in the mud. Gambling was a rhythmic trap of its own. A man who had spent 6 months breaking his back for a few ounces of dust could lose it all in a single game of faro or monte. The psychological toll of this loss was devastating. The peril of the gamble was not just the loss of money, it was the loss of hope. A miner who lost his stake was often left with nothing but the clothes on his back and a deep, burning resentment. This environment was a tinderbox. A spilled drink or a perceived cheat at cards could lead to a sudden flash of steel. The violence was rarely the organized duels of fiction. It was messy, frantic, and born of exhaustion and despair. Yet, within this chaotic social fabric, there was a strange, silent code of ethics known as the honest miner. In many camps, a man could leave a pan full of gold dust in his tent for a week and find it untouched. This was not necessarily because everyone was virtuous, but because the cost of being caught was so high. The social peril was the constant vigilance required to remain a good man in a place that did not seem to care about goodness. Men lived in a state of hyper-awareness, watching their neighbors and being watched in return. It was a community of strangers who relied on each other for survival, while simultaneously fearing each other's desperation. The role of Sabbath in the goldfields was another fascinating thread in the social fabric. In the early years, Sunday was a day of rest, not necessarily for religious reasons, but because the human body simply could not endure 7 days of labor. On Sundays, the sound of the picks stopped. The camps fell into a strange, heavy quiet. Men would use the time to wash their clothes, mend their boots, and write those precious letters home. It was a day of rehumanizing, a brief window where they were men again instead of miners. But as the competition for gold intensified, the Sabbath began to erode. The sound of the rockers started to bleed into Sunday mornings, and the quiet was replaced by the relentless 24/7 pursuit of wealth. This loss of rest was perhaps the greatest social peril of all, as it stripped away the last vestige of a normal life. There were also those who lived on the fringes of the mining society, the hermits who moved further into the mountains to escape the noise and the violence of the camps. These men faced the peril of total solitude. Without the messmate to watch their back, or the camp to provide a sense of belonging, they often slipped into eccentricity or madness. The silence of the high peaks was beautiful, but it was also a weight. A man who spends a year without hearing another human voice begins to lose his own. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, appreciate the sturdy, invisible walls of the society you live in. Feel the comfort of the laws, the presence of your neighbors, and the deep, reliable connections to the people you love. The chaos of the goldfields is a distant shadow, a story from a time when the world was raw and the social fabric was thin. Imagine the quiet of a Sunday afternoon in a mountain camp, the sound of a pen scratching on paper, the smell of clean laundry drying on a pine branch, and the heavy, peaceful breathing of men who have finally found a moment of rest. Let that stillness envelop you now. The world is safe, the rules are clear, and your rest is well earned. While the miners fought the earth and each other, they were perpetually at the mercy of a far more powerful and indifferent force, the atmosphere in the goldfields. The weather was not a topic of casual conversation. It was a matter of life and death. The peril of the elements was found in the sheer unpredictability of nature and the lack of any infrastructure to withstand its fury. From the scorching droughts of the California summer to the bone-chilling blizzards of the Klondike, and from the flash floods of the Australian outback to the devastating fires of the canvas cities, the environment was a volatile partner in the miner's pursuit of wealth. The first element to contend with was water, or the lack of it. In the Sierra Nevada, the mining season was dictated by the flow of the rivers. During the dry summer months, the smaller streams would often vanish, leaving nothing but a bed of cracked, sun-baked mud. Without water, the rockers and sluice boxers were useless. Miners would spend weeks dry washing, a process where they would toss dirt into the air and hope the wind would blow away the lighter dust while the gold fell into a pan. It was a dusty, choking labor that yielded very little. The sound of the summer was the dry, rhythmic rattling of gravel and the constant buzzing drone of heat-seeking insects. The peril here was economic and physical. A man could starve while sitting on a pile of gold because he had no way to wash it. But when the rains finally came, they brought a different, more violent danger. The steep canyons of the gold country were natural funnels for freshets, sudden, massive surges of water caused by storms high in the mountains. A miner sleeping in a tent on a gravel bar might be awakened in the middle of the night by a low, rhythmic rumble that sounded like a freight train. Within minutes, the dry stream would become a churning wall of mud, boulders, and uprooted trees. Everything the miner owned, his tools, his cradle, his cabin, and his stockpile of food, could be swept away in an instant. The peril of the flood was the loss of one's entire stake in a single, watery roar. Many a miner was left standing in the rain with nothing but the clothes on his back, watching his dreams tumble downstream toward the sea. In the higher elevations and the northern territories, the element of fire was replaced by the element of ice. The winter of the goldfields was a test of pure endurance. In the Yukon, the mercury would drop so low that the exhaled breath of a miner would freeze instantly, crackling in the air with a sound the locals called the whisper of the stars. In this extreme cold, the very earth became as hard as iron. To mine, men had to build giant fires on the ground to thaw a few inches of dirt, then scrape away the mud and build another fire. This fire setting was a slow, smoky, and exhausting process. The peril of the cold was the big sleep, hypothermia. A man who sat down to rest for just a moment might find his limbs becoming heavy and warm, a deceptive comfort that preceded the final frozen silence. Back in the crowded mining towns, where tents had been replaced by wooden shacks built side by side, the greatest fear was fire. These towns were tinderboxes. The wood was often unseasoned pine, full of resin, and the interiors were lined with paper or cloth to keep out the draft. Everyone used open flames for cooking and candles for light. All it took was a knocked-over lantern or a stray spark from a chimney to start a conflagration. Once a fire began, there was no stopping it. There were no fire departments and no water pressure. The sound of a town fire was a terrifying, rhythmic crackle pop as the pine boards exploded in the heat, followed by the frantic shouting of men trying to save their meager possessions. San Francisco, the gateway to the gold fields, burned to the ground 6 times in 2 years. The peril of fire was the constant, flickering reminder that everything a man built was temporary. The wind, too, played its part. In the Australian gold fields, the brickfielder winds would sweep across the plains, carrying tons of red dust into the camps. These dust storms were so thick they could turn mid-afternoon into a deep, rust-colored twilight. The dust would find its way into the miners' eyes, ears, and lungs, causing miners asthma and chronic inflammation. The sound of the wind was a mournful, rhythmic howling that rattled the corrugated iron roofs of the later shanties, a sound that could drive a lonely man to the brink of madness. It was an element that refused to be ignored, a constant, abrasive presence that wore down the skin and the spirit alike. Then there was the lightning. In the high mountain passes, summer storms would brew with terrifying speed. Miners working on exposed ridges with iron pickaxes and shovels were walking lightning rods. The rhythmic boom of thunder echoing through the granite canyons was a signal to drop the tools and seek shelter in a low dugout or under a rocky overhang. The peril was a sudden, blinding flash that could turn a man to ash in a heartbeat. It was a reminder that for all their digging and blasting, the miners were small and insignificant compared to the electrical fury of the sky. Despite these environmental hazards, there was a strange beauty to the elements. The miners lived closer to nature than almost any other group in the 19th century. They saw the first light of dawn on the snow-capped peaks and the purple shadows of the desert twilight. They heard the rhythmic music of the rain on the leaves and the deep, ancient silence of a frozen forest. The elements were their enemies, yes, but they were also the creators of the gold they sought. The rivers moved the silt, the ice broke the rock, and the heat dried the beds. The miners were part of a vast, elemental cycle, a rhythmic dance of destruction and creation that had been going on for millions of years before they arrived. Tonight, as you listen to the quiet sounds of your own home, feel the deep security of your shelter. The wind may blow outside, but you are warm. The rain may fall, but you are dry. The elements are no longer perils. They are merely the backdrop to your comfort. Imagine the mountain peaks glowing in the soft moonlight, the rivers flowing gently in their banks, and the air turning cool and still. Let the memory of the miners' struggle against the storms serve as a rhythmic lullaby, reminding you that the storm has passed and the night is a place of absolute safety. The fires are out, the winds are hushed, and the world is resting. The dream that drew thousands to the rivers and mountains was always centered on the return. Very few men set out with the intention of becoming permanent fixtures of the wilderness. They were there to make their pile and head back to the civilization they had left behind. But the peril of the trail's end was perhaps the most bittersweet of all. For many, the return was not a triumphal march, but a slow, limping retreat. The gold rush changed the men who participated in it, often in ways that made the lives they had previously led feel small, distant, and irrecoverable. The journey back was a mirror of the journey out, a long, rhythmic slog. But this time, it was weighted with the reality of what had been gained and what had been lost. For the successful few, those who actually carried heavy chamois bags of dust and nuggets, the peril was one of security. Carrying a fortune in a lawless land made a man a target. The walk back to the port cities, or the eastern settlements, was a period of intense, rhythmic paranoia. Every rustle in the brush, every snap of a twig, and every stranger encountered on the trail was a potential threat. A man who had survived the dangers of the deep and the invisible enemies of the camp now had to survive his fellow man. Successful miners often traveled in groups, keeping a rhythmic watch through the night, their hands never far from their sidearms. The weight of the gold was a physical burden, but the psychological weight of protecting it was even heavier. It was a treasure that demanded constant vigilance, turning the journey home into a final, exhausting gauntlet. However, for the vast majority, the played-out miners, the return was a struggle of a different sort. These were the men who had spent their health and their best years in the mud, and had nothing to show for it but a collection of scars and a deep, abiding weariness. The peril here was the shame of the failure. In the mid-19th century, a man's worth was often measured by his ability to provide and succeed. To return home empty-handed after a year or two of silence was a social death. Many miners stayed in the fields long after the gold was gone, trapped in a rhythmic cycle of just one more day, simply because they couldn't face the disappointment of their families. They became the ghosts of the gold rush, drifting from one dying camp to the next, their eyes fixed on the ground, their spirits as eroded as the riverbanks they worked. The physical toll of the mining life did not vanish once the tools were set down. The long-term effects were a silent peril that followed the miners home. Chronic rheumatism, respiratory issues from the bad air of the shafts, and the lingering effects of scurvy meant that many men returned as shadows of their former selves. The rhythmic ache in their joints was a constant reminder of the winters spent in icy streams. Some had miner's consumption, a cough that never quite went away, a legacy of the dust and the damp. They found that they could no longer perform the steady, quiet work of the farm or the shop. The intense, high-stakes labor of the goldfields had ruined them for the slow, predictable pace of ordinary life. Then there was the psychological restlessness. Once a man has lived through the feverish highs and lows of a gold rush, the quiet routine of a village can feel suffocating. The peril of the ordinary was a real struggle for returning miners. They had grown used to the vast horizons, the absolute freedom and absolute danger, and the camaraderie of the camps. Back home, they were expected to fit into the social boxes they had discarded. Many found themselves staring out of windows, their minds drifting back to the rhythmic sound of the rocker box and the smell of pine smoke. They were men out of time, forever haunted by the memory of a world where a single shovelful of dirt could change everything. For those who had to travel back by sea, the Cape Horners, or those crossing the Isthmus of Panama, the perils were once again elemental. The return voyage was often a cramped, miserable experience on overcrowded ships where ship's fever typhus ran rampant. The rhythmic swaying of the vessel and the endless blue monotony of the Pacific or Atlantic offered too much time for reflection. Men sat on the decks, watching the waves, and tallied the cost of their ambition. They counted the friends they had buried in unmarked graves by the Yuba or the Fraser rivers. They looked at their calloused hands and wondered if the few ounces of gold they carried were worth the peace of their soul they had left in the mountains. The actual homecoming was often a moment of profound disconnection. A miner would walk up the path to his house, looking like a stranger. His skin was darkened by the sun, his hair was grayed by stress, and his clothes were the rough wool of the diggings. His children had grown, his wife had learned to live without him. The rail's end was the realization that the world had moved on while he was frozen in the rhythmic labor of the gulch. There was a period of relearning how to be a husband, a father, and a citizen. Some never managed it. They would eventually pack their bags again, drawn back to the wilderness by a call they couldn't explain, a need for the peril they had learned to survive. As we conclude this section, imagine the long line of men walking away from the goldfields. Some are upright and wealthy, others are stooped and broken, but all are changed. The sound of the journey is the rhythmic clump-clump of boots on a well-worn path, moving away from the noise and toward the quiet. The sun is setting behind the mountains, casting long, peaceful shadows over the abandoned claims. The picks are rusting, the tents are rotting, and the rivers are beginning to heal their banks. Tonight, as you rest in the absolute certainty of your own life, feel the deep gratitude for the trail's end that leads to your own bed. You are not a stranger in your own home. Your health is your own, and your peace is undisturbed by the ghost of a gold pan. Let the image of the returning miner, finally laying down his burden and closing his eyes in a familiar room, be your final thought. The long journey is over. The ambition is stilled. The home is reached. Sleep now in the quiet, steady rhythm of the present. When the color ran out, the end of a mining town didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a rhythmic, hollow echoing of footsteps. The peril of the ghost town was the peril of abandonment, the sudden, silent realization that a place once vibrating with the energy of thousands was being reclaimed by the indifference of the earth. As the gold veins pinched out, or the riverbeds yielded nothing but smooth, gray stones, the miners moved on to the next rush with the same frantic pace with which they had arrived. Left behind was the skeletal remains of ambition, a landscape of rotting timber, rusting iron, and the profound, heavy silence of a discarded world. Imagine standing in the center of a town like Bodie, or one of the countless unnamed bar camps along the American River, just days after the Exodus. The sound of the town has changed. The constant, industrial thud-clack of the rockers and the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer are gone. In their place is the rhythmic creak of a swinging door on a rusted hinge and the sigh of the wind as it whistles through the gaps in unpainted siding. This transition from noise to silence is the true essence of a ghost town. The air, once thick with the smoke of 1,000 hearths and the dust of heavy commerce, turns crisp and clear again, but it carries a new chill. The chill of a place that has lost its pulse. The architecture of the gold rush, as we discussed earlier, was never meant to last. It was a provisional architecture built for the moment. Without the constant maintenance of human hands, these structures began a slow, rhythmic decay. The canvas roofs were the first to go, shredded by the winter winds, until they hung in tatters like the sails of a ghost ship. Then the wood began to silver. Unprotected pine and fir, exposed to the intense mountain sun and the biting frost, would lose its amber hue and turn a ghostly, weathered gray. The peril of the ghost town was the structural treachery of this decay. Floorboards would rot from the bottom up as the damp earth reclaimed them, and chimneys, once the warm heart of the cabin, would lean precariously, eventually collapsing in a rhythmic rumble of dry stone and dust. Walking through an abandoned camp, one would find the artifacts of the everyday left behind, as if the owners intended to return at any moment, because the journey to the next strike was often long and arduous. Miners could only carry the essentials. Left in the dust were the heavy, rusted remains of frying pans, broken shovels, and thousands of empty tin cans, the tin can trail that marked the path of 19th century expansion. There is a specific, quiet peril in these ruins, the danger of memory. To see a discarded boot worn through at the heel, or a broken ceramic pipe lying in the dirt, is to be reminded of the individual struggles that took place in this now sealant gulch. The town becomes a graveyard of effort, where the only thing that remains is the evidence of what men were willing to endure for a dream that ultimately vanished. The invisible enemies of the camp did not leave when the men did. Abandoned wells and open mine shafts became hidden traps, overgrown with weeds and brush. The peril of the landscape was now its unpredictability. A person or an animal walking through the ruins of a ghost town might suddenly find the earth giving way beneath them. The coyote holes we discussed earlier, now masked by years of fallen needles and tall grass. The shafts, once the source of hope, became dark, vertical voids waiting in the silence. The rhythmic drip-drip of water continued in the tunnels, slowly eroding the timber supports until, one by one, the deep chambers would collapse with a muffled thud that no one was left to hear. As the years passed, the social fabric was replaced by the natural fabric. Wildlife, once driven away by the noise and the smoke, began to creep back into the streets. Mountain lions might find shelter in the basement of a former hotel. Owls would nest in the rafters of a collapsing church. The rhythmic sounds of the forest, the tapping of a woodpecker on a hollow log, the rustle of a deer through the dry brush, became the new heartbeat of the town. There is a peace in this reclamation, but it is a melancholy peace. It is the sound of the earth digesting the gold rush, slowly breaking down the iron and the wood until it is once again part of the mineral and the moss. For the few ghosts who stayed behind, the eccentric hermits, or the miners who refused to believe the gold was gone, the ghost town was a peril of the mind. Living in a town built for 5,000, when you are the only soul left, is a psychological weight. The rhythmic habit of checking the mail at a post office that no longer exists, or walking to the saloon that has no whiskey and no customers, is a form of living memory that can slip into madness. These figures became part of the ruins themselves, their lives a slow, quiet fade into the landscape, their voices eventually joining the wind in the pines. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the vast, quiet expanse of the high country where these towns once stood. The sun is setting over a silvered ridge, casting long, peaceful shadows through the empty windows of a log cabin. There is no noise here, no hurry, and no ambition. The earth is still, the ruins are soft, and the history is resting beneath a thick blanket of pine needles. Feel the weight of the silence, not as a void, but as a soothing, heavy quilt. The world has moved on, the gold is forgotten, and the mountains are at peace. Let the rhythmic creaking of the old wood act as a gentle, steady lullaby, guiding you into a deep and undisturbed rest. As the era of the individual miner began to fade, a new and far more formidable peril emerged: the era of industrial-scale extraction. The shift from the handheld gold pan to the massive, high-pressure water cannons known as monitors changed the landscape of the gold fields forever. This was the birth of hydraulic mining, a process that replaced the quiet, rhythmic splashing of the stream with a deafening, mechanical roar. The industrial monster was not just a machine, it was a fundamental shift in how humanity interacted with the earth. No longer were men seeking gold by following the natural contours of the land. They were now dismantling the land itself, piece by shattered piece. The center of this new peril was the monitor, a giant iron nozzle that looked like a piece of heavy artillery. These devices were connected to miles of elaborate wooden flumes and iron pipes that channeled water from high mountain reservoirs down into the gulches. Gravity created an immense, terrifying pressure. When the valve was opened, a solid jet of water, sometimes 8 inches in diameter, would scream out of the nozzle with enough force to kill a man instantly or move a boulder weighing several tons. The sound of the hydraulic mine was a constant, bone-shaking hum, a rhythmic, high-velocity vibration that could be heard miles away, echoing through the canyons like the breath of a dragon. For the laborers working the monitors, the peril was immediate and physical. They stood in the giant's path, directing the water at the base of massive cliffs of ancient gravel. The goal was to undermine the hillside until it collapsed in a rhythmic, terrifying avalanche of mud and stone. The danger of a cave-in was no longer confined to a narrow shaft. It was an entire mountain falling toward you. The ground beneath the miner's feet was a perpetual slurry of thick, liquid earth. A man could be swept away by the very runoff he was creating, buried in seconds under 20 feet of slickens, the muddy waste product of the process. The slickens themselves were a new kind of environmental peril. As the mountains were melted away by the monitors, millions of tons of silt, sand, and gravel were washed into the river systems. This was a slow-motion disaster that the miners of the early days could never have imagined. The rhythmic flow of the rivers was choked. The beds rose, and the once clear mountain water turned into a thick, opaque soup the color of chocolate. This silt traveled hundreds of miles downstream, burying farmland in the valleys and causing catastrophic floods in cities far removed from the goldfields. The peril had expanded. It was no longer just the miner's life at stake, but the very health of the entire watershed. Working at a hydraulic site was a sensory assault. Unlike the lonely silence of the Coyote Hole, the industrial mine was a place of frantic mechanical movement. Long lines of sluice boxes, sometimes stretching for thousands of feet, were lined with blocks of wood or stones called riffles. Into these boxes, the melted mountain was funneled. To keep the gold from washing away in the torrent, miners added quicksilver liquid mercury to the riffles. The mercury would catch the gold, forming a heavy amalgam. The peril here was invisible. The mercury would inevitably leak into the water and the soil, a toxic legacy that would remain in the ecosystem for centuries. The miners handled this quicksilver with their bare hands, unaware that the rhythmic, heavy metal was slowly poisoning their nervous systems. The scale of the operation required a new type of organization. The independent miner was replaced by the wage worker. Men no longer worked for the dream of a sudden strike. They worked 10-hour shifts for a set daily wage, often under the watchful eye of a foreman. The psychological peril of this shift was profound. The freedom of the gold rush had been replaced by the rhythmic, grinding boredom of industrial labor. The work was still backbreaking, shoveling heavy debris, clearing boulders, and maintaining the miles of leaky flumes. But the hope that fueled the early pioneers had been replaced by the cold calculations of a corporation. As the monitors ate further into the hillsides, they left behind a lunar landscape. Vast, jagged amphitheaters of red and yellow earth were carved into the green mountains. These badlands were stripped of all vegetation and topsoil, leaving nothing but the skeletal remains of the ancient riverbeds. The sound of these sights at night, when the water was turned off, was an eerie, rhythmic drip and thud as the saturated cliffs continued to settle and slump. It was a landscape in mourning, a place where the ancient silence of the forest had been violently replaced by a permanent, scarred emptiness. The legal battle that eventually ended hydraulic mining was a slow, bureaucratic process, the rhythmic scratching of pens we will discuss in later sections. But until the courts intervened, the industrial monster reigned supreme. It was an era of unprecedented efficiency and unprecedented destruction. The miners who operated the monitors were part of a great mechanical heart, pumping the lifeblood of the mountains through iron veins to extract the glittering treasure hidden within. They were the masters of the water, yet they were also the servants of the machine. Tonight, as you settle into the stillness of your room, contrast the violent roar of the monitor with the profound peace of the present. The mountains are no longer being melted away. They are standing tall, draped in the soft, dark shadows of the night. The rivers have long since cleared their silt, and the only sound is the gentle, rhythmic pulse of nature reclaiming its territory. Imagine the cool, damp air of a forest that has grown back over a forgotten mine, the moss covering the rusted iron pipes, and the silence that has finally returned to the canyons. Let the memory of that industrial noise serve as a distant, fading hum that pulls you deeper into the quiet safety of sleep. The monster is stilled, the water is calm, and the earth is at rest. As the gold rush entered its final, most mechanical phase, the landscape witnessed the arrival of the most imposing industrial monster of all, the bucket-line dredge. If the hydraulic monitor was a sword that cut into the hillsides, the dredge was a slow, rhythmic digestive system that consumed entire valley floors. These massive, floating fortresses of iron and wood were essentially gold-finding factories built on barges. They did not wait for the gold to be revealed. They moved the entire world to find it. The peril of the dredge was the peril of the inexorable, a relentless mechanical hunger that transformed lush river bottoms into desolate piles of bone-white stone. To imagine a dredge is to imagine a building-sized machine sitting in a self-made pond. At the front of this beast was a bucket ladder, a massive steel arm equipped with a continuous loop of heavy iron buckets, each capable of holding several tons of earth. These buckets moved in a slow, rhythmic rotation, biting into the riverbank with a sound that could be felt in the marrow of one's bones. It was a deep, guttural clank grind that never stopped, day or night. The dredge was a creature of perpetual motion, eating its way forward while simultaneously defecating a trail of waste behind it. For the men who worked aboard these mechanical leviathans, the peril was one of mechanical violence and sensory deprivation. The interior of a dredge was a nightmare of noise and vibration. Huge trommels, rotating cylindrical screens, tumbled the excavated earth, while hypersure jets of water washed the debris. The roar was so absolute that communication was handled through hand signals or rhythmic taps on metal pipes. A man working near the bucket line lived in constant danger of being caught in the machinery. The dredge did not distinguish between a boulder and a human limb. The vibration of the massive engines hummed through the soles of their boots, a rhythmic frequency that led to a specific kind of physical exhaustion known as dredge lag. The tailings were the most visible legacy of this era. As the dredge processed the earth, the useless stones and gravel were carried to the rear by a long conveyor belt called a stacker and dumped in high rhythmic mounds. These tailing piles looked like the spine of a prehistoric serpent, stretching for miles along the valley floor. Because the dredge turned the soil upside down, burying the fertile topsoil under several feet of sterile washed river rock, nothing would grow on these mounds for a century. The peril was the permanent sterilization of the land. The beautiful, fertile meadows that had once supported indigenous populations and diverse wildlife were replaced by a rhythmic, gray desert of stone. The dredge operated on a principle of low-grade, high-volume. It was the ultimate expression of the industrialization of the goldfields. No longer was a miner looking for a pocket of wealth. The corporation was looking for a fraction of an ounce of gold per ton of earth. This required the dredge to work 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The rhythmic peril here was the loss of the human cycle. The men worked in rotating shifts, their lives dictated by the maintenance schedule of the buckets and the lubrication of the gears. They were the attendants to a god of iron, feeding it grease and electricity so that it might continue its slow, destructive crawl through the valley. There was a strange, hypnotic quality to the dredge's movement. It would pivot on a massive steel spud driven into the pond floor, swinging its bucket ladder back and forth in a slow, rhythmic arc. From a distance, it looked like a giant, prehistoric animal grazing in the water, but up close, it was a scene of industrial chaos. The water in the dredge pond was a thick, gray slurry of silt and clay, so dense that a man falling in would find it nearly impossible to swim. This dead water was the only environment the dredge knew, a self-contained world of mud and machinery that isolated the workers from the living forest only yards away. At night, the dredge was a constellation of electric lights in the dark wilderness. The glowing windows and the sparking of the heavy electrical cables created a surreal, futuristic image against the ancient backdrop of the mountains. The sound of the dredge at night, the distant, rhythmic thud and whir, served as a reminder to anyone within 5 miles that the earth was being processed. It was a sound that replaced the hoot of the owl and the rush of the wind, a mechanical heartbeat that asserted dominance over the natural world. The peril of the dredge also extended to the history it erased. As these machines chewed through the valleys, they often destroyed the early mining sites we discussed in previous sections. The coyote holes, the original cabins, and the early rockers were all swallowed by the buckets and ground into silt. The dredge was a giant eraser, wiping away the physical evidence of the 1849 pioneers to reach the gold they had missed. It was a history that consumed its own past, leaving nothing behind but those rhythmic, stony ridges of tailings. Tonight, as you lie in the absolute stillness of your own room, imagine the great iron buckets of the dredge finally coming to a halt. The massive engines have cooled, the conveyor belts are silent, and the clank grind has faded into the archives of time. The valley is quiet again. The tailing piles, once sharp and jagged, are now being softened by the slow, rhythmic growth of lichen and moss. The industrial monster is a rusting skeleton, a silent monument to a time of insatiable hunger. Let the profound silence of the reclaimed valley be your blanket. The machinery is stilled, the water is clear, and the earth is no longer being moved. Sleep now in the steady, unhurried peace of a world that has finally found its rest. In the quiet, overworked corners of the gold fields, where the white miners had long since abandoned their claims as played out, a different kind of rhythm emerged. This was the steady, meticulous, and incredibly patient labor of the Chinese miners. Their experience was a unique chapter in the perilous history of the gold rush, a story not of sudden bursts of wealth or industrial monsters, but of endurance in the face of both a harsh landscape and a hostile social environment. The peril of the Chinese miner was often found in the invisible spaces, the rejected dirt, the marginalized camps, and the silent systemic pressures of a society that wanted their labor but not their presence. The arrival of the Chinese in the gold fields, primarily from the Guangdong province, introduced a level of collective organization that was rarely seen among the individualistic European and American prospectors. While the stereotypical miner was a lone figure with a pan, the Chinese often worked in companies or associations. This was a rhythmic, communal effort. They moved through the landscape like a precision instrument, reworking the tailings, the mounds of discarded rock and dirt left behind by others. Where a previous miner had been impatient, seeking only large nuggets, the Chinese companies were thorough. They would line up and methodically wash every handful of earth, extracting the fine gold dust that everyone else had missed. The sound of their work was a soft, rhythmic shuffling of many feet and the steady, communal splashing of water, a quieter, more disciplined version of the gold rush clamor. The physical peril for these laborers was exacerbated by their living conditions, forbidden by local codes from settling in the center of the established camps. They built their own villages on the fringes, often in the low-lying, swampy areas, or on the rocky slopes that no one else wanted. These Chinatowns were clusters of small, rhythmic structures made of scrap wood, mud bricks, and thatch. While these camps were often cleaner and more organized than the chaotic tent cities of the 49ers, their location made them vulnerable. In the winter, they were the first to be flooded by the rising rivers. In the summer, they were the most oppressed by the stagnant heat and the mosquitoes. The invisible enemy of disease was a constant threat, yet the Chinese miners relied on their own traditional medicine, herbal teas, acupuncture, and a diet that, ironically, made them more resilient than their neighbors. By drinking boiled tea instead of raw creek water and eating dried vegetables and ginger, they avoided the worst of the cholera and scurvy that decimated other camps. However, the social peril was relentless. As the easy gold disappeared, resentment toward the successful Chinese companies grew. This led to the foreign miners' tax, a rhythmic monthly extortion designed specifically to drive them out of the diggings. Tax collectors, often accompanied by armed men, would descend on the Chinese camps, demanding payment in gold dust. If a miner couldn't produce his receipt, he faced physical violence or the destruction of his claim. The peril here was the law as a weapon. The Chinese were frequently barred from testifying in court against white men, meaning they were effectively outside the protection of the law. They lived in a state of constant rhythmic vigilance, always watching the trail for the arrival of the taxman or the regulators who sought to harass them. Despite this hostility, The Chinese miners were responsible for some of the most impressive feats of engineering in the goldfields. They built miles of rhythmic stone walls and elaborate water-carrying ditches that still contoured the hillsides today. Using traditional techniques from the Pearl River Delta, they managed water with a precision that surpassed the crude flumes of the Americans. They turned wasteland into productive gardens, growing cabbage, bok choy, and melons in the middle of the dry canyons. The sound of this labor was the rhythmic chink-chink of iron tools against stone, a sound of persistence. They were not just mining gold, they were cultivating a landscape that seemed determined to reject them. There was a profound psychological peril in their isolation. Most of these men were sojourners. They had left wives and children in China with the rhythmic promise of returning with the Golden Mountain in their pockets. They lived in a bachelor society, separated from their culture by thousands of miles of ocean. The only connection to home was the letter writer and the rhythmic arrival of supply ships bringing familiar comforts, dried fish, soy sauce, and tea. In the evenings, the Chinese camps were quiet. The smoke from their small, efficient stoves carried the scent of sandalwood and ginger, a sharp contrast to the salt pork and wood smoke of the neighboring tents. They lived in a cultural bubble, a rhythmic echo of a world that existed across the Pacific, maintaining their traditions and their dignity in a place that offered them very little of either. As the gold rush eventually transitioned into the era of the railroad, many of these forgotten laborers moved from the mines to the granite cliffs of the Sierra Nevada to build the transcontinental railroad. They took with them the same rhythmic discipline and the same familiarity with peril, handling black powder and hanging from baskets over 1,000-foot drops. The gold fields were their training ground, a place where they learned to endure the unendurable. The history of the gold rush is incomplete without the story of these men who worked the margins, finding value in what others threw away and building the infrastructure of the West with silent, rhythmic determination. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the quiet of a hillside where a stone wall still stands, built by hands that are now long gone. The rivers have washed away the tailings, and the Chinatowns have vanished back into the earth, leaving only a few shards of blue and white porcelain buried in the mud. The noise of the conflict and the sting of the tax are gone. There is only the peaceful, rhythmic sound of the wind moving through the tall grass that now covers the old claims. Let the image of that quiet, meticulous patience be your guide. The struggle is over, the patience has been rewarded with eternal rest, and the land is finally still. Sleep now in the deep, rhythmic shadow of a history that remembers every hand that touched the earth. While the miners were busy breaking their backs in the mud, a different kind of prospector was working the dry land of the port cities and the supply hubs. These were the merchant kings, the men who realized that the most reliable vein of gold wasn't located in the riverbeds, but in the pockets of the miners themselves. However, the peril of the merchant kings was not one of physical labor, but of a rhythmic, high-stakes gamble against time, distance, and the fickle nature of the market. To be a merchant in a gold rush was to live in a state of perpetual administrative anxiety, where a single delayed ship or a sudden fire could turn a merchant prince into a pauper overnight. The primary peril for the merchant was the rhythm of the supply chain. In the mid-19th century, nearly everything a miner needed, from the iron of his pickaxe to the flour in his bowl, had to be shipped from thousands of miles away. In San Francisco or Melbourne, the arrival of a ship was the heartbeat of the economy. A merchant would sit in his counting house, listening for the rhythmic boom of a signal gun from the harbor announcing a new arrival. If he was the first to reach the docks and buy up a cargo of shovels or boots, he could charge 1,000% markup. If 3 ships arrived at once with the same cargo, the price would collapse, and he would be left with a warehouse full of rotting, unsellable inventory. It was a rhythmic feast or famine, a financial gold fever that was just as addictive and just as dangerous as the one in the mountains. The physical environment of the merchant was the warehouse, a structure often more perilous than a mine shaft. In the early days, these were frequently made of the same oil-soaked canvas and unseasoned pine as the miners' tents. They were cavernous fire traps, filled with highly flammable goods, barrels of whiskey, crates of dry matches, and tons of salted meat. The sound of the merchant's life was the rhythmic scratching of a quill pen on ledger paper, interrupted by the terrifying, frequent tolling of the fire bell. When a city like San Francisco burned, the merchants lost everything. They didn't just lose their buildings. They lost the capital they had spent months accumulating. There are accounts of merchants who, after seeing their warehouses go up in flames, walked down to the water's edge and simply vanished, unable to face the rhythmic cycle of starting over from nothing. The peril of the price was another constant shadow. In the goldfields, the value of money was distorted beyond recognition. A merchant might pay $10 for a barrel of flour in New York and sell it for $100 in the mountains, but only if the trails were open. If a rhythmic winter storm blocked the mountain passes, the merchant's pack trains would be stranded. The mules would die in the snow, and the precious cargo would be lost. The merchant lived and died by the weather just as much as the miner, but his claim was spread out over hundreds of miles of treacherous trail. He was a manager of logistics in a world without telegraphs or railroads, relying on the slow, rhythmic pace of the mule and the sail. Then there was the peril of the rot. Before the advent of modern packaging, food was a ticking time bomb. Flour would become clumpy and infested with weevils. Salt pork would turn rancid in the damp heat of a ship's hold. Sugar would melt into a sticky, useless syrup. A merchant's wealth was literally decomposing before his eyes. He had to move his goods with a rhythmic urgency, constantly turning over his stock before the elements reclaimed it. The smell of a merchant's warehouse was a pungent, rhythmic mixture of spices, wet wool, decaying grain, and the sharp, metallic scent of new iron, a sensory reminder of the fragility of commerce in the wilderness. The social peril for the merchant kings was their reputation. In a society of desperate men, the merchant was often seen as a parasite, the man who got rich while others suffered. They were the Shylocks of the diggings, charging an ounce of gold for an ounce of salt. This resentment could boil over into violence. During times of shortage or famine, angry mobs of miners would occasionally descend on a merchant's store, demanding fair prices at the end of a pistol. The merchant had to be a diplomat, a bookkeeper, and a guard all at once. He lived in a gold cage, surrounded by wealth, but perpetually isolated from the men he served. As the gold rush matured, the rhythmic scratching of the quill became more complex. The merchant kings transitioned from simple traders to bankers and land speculators. They began to issue scrip and banknotes, creating a paper economy on top of the physical gold. This introduced the peril of the bank run. If rumors spread that a merchant's vault was empty, a rhythmic panic would grip the city. Men would line up 4 blocks, demanding their gold. It was a psychological avalanche, a sudden collapse of trust that could level a financial empire in a single afternoon. The merchant, who had survived fires and shipwrecks, could be destroyed by a single whispered word in a saloon. Yet there was a quiet, sedentary peace in the merchant's life that the miner never knew. In the late hours, after the shutters were closed and the lamps were lit, the merchant would sit at his desk and balance his books. The sound of the gold coins being counted, a rhythmic, metallic clink clink clink, was the music of his success. He was the architect of the new world, the man who provided the tools for the destruction of the old one. He saw the gold rush not as a fever, but as a series of rhythmic transactions, a steady flow of material from the old world to the new. Tonight, as you settle into the soft, reliable comfort of your own bed, think of the immense, invisible systems of trade that bring you everything you need. The perils of the merchant kings are long gone, replaced by the silent, digital rhythms of modern commerce. Imagine the quiet of an old counting house at midnight, the smell of ink and old paper, the steady tick of a grandfather clock, and the heavy iron door of the safe standing guard over the day's earnings. The fires are out, the ships are at anchor, and the ledgers are closed. The world is balanced, the debts are paid, and the night is a place of absolute security. Sleep now in the steady, unhurried rhythm of a world that has been perfectly accounted for. As the frantic early years of the gold rush began to settle into a more permanent state of existence, the peril of the lawless was slowly replaced by a new, more tedious kind of danger: the arrival of the bureaucrats. This was the era of the law of the long shadow, where the informal, rhythmic justice of the miners' courts was overtaken by the slow, grinding machinery of the state. The transition was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by the rhythmic scratching of thousands of pens and the steady accumulation of paper. The peril here was no longer the sudden flash of a knife or the roar of a mob. It was the death by 1,000 stamps, the bureaucratic taming of the wilderness that turned a free man into a taxpayer and a claim holder into a litigant. The first shadow to fall across the gold fields was that of the land surveyor. In the beginning, a claim was marked by a simple rhythmic pounding of wooden stakes and a notice posted on a tree. It was a physical, visual agreement between neighbors, but as the law of the long shadow arrived, the surveyor brought his transit and his chain. He didn't see the gold or the beauty of the canyon. He saw lines of latitude and longitude, townships and ranges. The sound of this new era was the rhythmic clinkling of the measuring chain being dragged across the rocks. This was the peril of the overlap. For many miners, the surveyor's lines did not match their stakes. Suddenly, a man who had worked a patch of dirt for 3 years found himself in a rhythmic, legal battle over a boundary dispute. The earth was being subdivided by men in distant offices who had never seen a gold pan. Following the surveyor came the tax collector and the recorder of deeds. These figures represented the long shadow of the government, reaching out from the capital to claim a portion of every ounce of dust. The peril was the monotony of the fee. Every transaction, every claim, and every barrel of whiskey now required a license, a stamp, or a filing fee. For a miner used to the absolute freedom of the hills, this was a psychological suffocation. The rhythmic arrival of the official notice became a new source of anxiety. Men who had survived mountain lions and cholera were now defeated by the rhythmic demand. The steady, unavoidable cycle of payments required to keep what they had already earned. The government was mining the miners, not with shovels, but with ledgers. The miners' courts, which had once delivered swift, if rough, justice, were replaced by formal circuit courts. These were the rooms where the real gold was often extracted. A court case in a mining district was a masterpiece of boredom. Lawyers, who flocked to the gold fields in numbers second only to the miners themselves, would argue for weeks over the phrasing of a mining code or the validity of a Spanish land grant. The sound of the law was the rhythmic, droning voice of the barrister and the heavy thump of the judge's gavel. The peril was the infinite delay. A miner involved in a lawsuit could not work his claim. He had to sit in a hot, dusty courtroom, watching his savings disappear into the rhythmic, hourly fees of his legal counsel. Justice was no longer fast. It was a glacier, moving with a rhythmic, crushing weight that favored those with the most paper and the deepest pockets. This era also saw the arrival of the blue laws and the taming of the social environment. The wild, rhythmic chaos of the Sunday camps was suppressed by ordinances and regulations. Gambling halls were taxed into submission, and the rot-gut saloons were forced to follow closing hours. This was the peril of the mundane. The gold rush was being sanitized, its edges polished by the rhythmic application of civility. For many of the original pioneers, this was the signal to move on. They felt the shadow growing longer and colder, turning their adventurous life into a regulated industry. The wilderness was being mapped, named, and filed away in a mahogany cabinet in the city. The long shadow also brought with it the peril of the property title. In many gold rush regions, especially in California, the land had originally been held under Mexican land grants, vast, vaguely defined tracts of land owned by old families. When the miners arrived, they ignored these grants, treating the land as public domain. But as the lawyers arrived, these old titles were resurrected. A miner might wake up one morning to find that his entire gulch actually belonged to a don or a land syndicate that had held the paper for 50 years. The rhythmic legal battles to quiet the title lasted for decades. It was a war of documents, where a faded signature on a piece of parchment was more powerful than 1,000 men with picks and shovels. Despite the boredom and the fees, there was a quiet, stabilizing peace in the arrival of the law. The rhythmic violence of the early days faded. Schools were built, churches were established, and the long shadow eventually became a protective canopy for those who wanted to build a lasting society. The peril of the bureaucrat was the price paid for the security of the citizen. The miners were no longer outlaws or adventurers. They were subjects of the record. Their lives were being inscribed into the history of the state, one rhythmic entry at a time. Tonight, as you settle into the profound order of your own life, feel the comfort of the shadow that protects you. You live in a world of clear titles, reliable laws, and steady records. The chaos of the lawless wilderness is a distant memory, a story from a time before the pens began their work. Imagine the quiet of a county recorder's office at night, the rows of heavy, leather-bound books, the smell of old paper and dust, and the deep, silent peace of a history that has been perfectly filed away. There are no more disputes, no more overlaps, and no more sudden demands. The world is mapped, the boundaries are set, and the record is complete. Sleep now in the steady, unhurried rhythm of a world that is safe, secure, and known. While the miners and the merchants were focused on the glittering wealth hidden in the gravel, a silent, rhythmic catastrophe was unfolding in the landscape around them. The peril to the wild was not a sudden event, but a slow, cumulative erosion of the ancient biological systems that had existed for millennia. The gold rush did not just move dirt. It fundamentally altered the rhythm of the forest, the clarity of the water, and the survival of the creatures that called the mountains home. To the miners, the wilderness was often seen as an adversary to be conquered or a resource to be consumed. But as the years passed, the wild became a ghost of its former self, a landscape stripped of its rhythm and replaced by a scarred, silent emptiness. The first and most visible victim was the forest. A gold rush required an immense, rhythmic consumption of timber. Wood was needed for everything: the walls of the cabins, the sleepers of the roads, the fuel for the thousands of campfires, and the massive flumes that carried water to the diggings. Thousands of acres of ancient pine, fir, and cedar were felled in a matter of months. The sound of the wilderness changed from the soft, rhythmic sighing of the wind through the needles to the constant, sharp thwack of the axe and the rhythmic, rasping scream of the crosscut saw. As the trees vanished, the peril of the slope emerged. Without the rhythmic root systems of the forest to hold the earth in place, the hillsides became unstable. Rain, once absorbed by the deep forest floor, now washed directly into the gulches, causing the flash floods and landslides we discussed in earlier sections. The forest was no longer a canopy, it was a stump field. This loss of cover led to the peril of the vanishing shadow. Many of the animals that inhabited the gold country, the black bear, the mountain lion, and the elk, relied on the deep, rhythmic shadows of the forest for protection and hunting. As the timber vanished and the noise of the camps increased, these animals were driven further and further into the high, inhospitable peaks. Those that remained were hunted for camp meat. A miner, tired of the rhythmic monotony of salt pork, would take his rifle into the woods to find anything that moved. The results were devastating. In California, the grizzly bear, once so numerous that it was a constant threat to travelers, was hunted into a rhythmic decline that would eventually lead to its total extinction in the state. The wild was becoming a quieter place, not because it was at peace, but because its voices were being stilled. The water, too, was a victim of this rhythmic destruction. We have already discussed the slickens of the hydraulic mines and the silt of the dredges, but the peril of the stream went deeper than just mud. Mining operations often involved the use of mercury and cyanide to separate the gold from the rock. These toxins, handled with a rhythmic carelessness, seeped into the groundwater and the riverbeds. The fish, particularly the salmon and the trout that relied on the rhythmic, seasonal flow of clear water to spawn, found their world turned into a toxic, opaque soup. Their spawning beds were buried under several feet of tailings, and their migratory paths were blocked by the dams and flumes of the water companies. The rhythmic leap of the salmon in the spring became a rare, and eventually a vanished, sight. The rivers were still moving, but they were no longer living. Then there was the peril of the micro-landscape. The gold rush brought with it an army of invasive species. In the hay used to feed the thousands of mules and oxen, seeds from the old world were carried into the wilderness. Plants like star thistle, mustard, and wild oats began a rhythmic, aggressive colonization of the disturbed soil. They choked out the native grasses and wildflowers that had sustained the local ecosystem for ages. This changed the rhythm of the season. The mountain meadows, once a riot of diverse colors and scents, became a monoculture of invasive weeds. The insects and birds that relied on the native plants vanished in turn, creating a rhythmic collapse of the food chain that started at the very bottom of the dirt. The peril to the wild also included the very air itself. the thousands of fires, combined with the later industrial smelters and the steam engines of the dredges, created a rhythmic, hazy smog that settled into the deep valleys. The pristine mountain air, once famous for its clarity, was often thick with the scent of burning resin and the metallic temps of industrial waste. For the miner, this was the smell of progress, but for the wild, it was a rhythmic suffocation. The mosses and lichens, which acted as the lungs of the mountain rocks, withered under the chemical assault, turning from vibrant greens to a sickly, rhythmic gray. As the gold eventually ran out and the humans moved on, the wild began a slow, rhythmic process of reclamation. But the landscape that returned was not the one that had been lost. The second-growth forest was often a different mix of species, lacking the diversity of the ancient woods. The rivers, while they eventually cleared, remained permanently altered in their course and their chemistry. The peril of the wild was that it could never truly go back to year zero. The gold rush had left a rhythmic signature in the soil and the water that would remain for geological time. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, appreciate the resilience and the fragility of the natural world. The ancient forests are still there, in the quiet corners of the world, maintaining their own rhythmic cycles of growth and decay. Imagine the deep, absolute silence of a mountain peak where the snow is falling, covering the old scars and the forgotten tailings with a thick, white blanket of peace. The air is cold and pure, the water is clear beneath the ice, and the wild is dreaming of a time when the only sound was the wind. Let the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the living earth be your lullaby. The storms have passed, the machines are gone, and the wild is finally allowed to be itself again. Sleep now in the quiet, green shadow of a world that has learned to heal. In the traditional retelling of the gold rush, the canvas is dominated by the solitary male prospector, silhouetted against a rugged mountain peak. But as the initial chaos of the first strikes settled into a more permanent, rhythmic struggle, a different presence began to emerge in the camps. The peril of the women of the goldfields was a unique, multifaceted experience that combined the physical hardships of the wilderness with the heavy, rhythmic expectations of 19th-century domesticity. Whether they were wives who had followed their husbands across the plains, entrepreneurs seeking their own fortunes, or soiled doves working the edges of the saloons, these women inhabited a world where they were often vastly outnumbered and constantly under the microscope of a bachelor society. The first peril for a woman in the goldfields was the journey itself. For those who traveled by wagon, the rhythmic monotony of the trail was compounded by the responsibility of maintaining a home in a moving vessel. It was the woman who ensured the beans were soaked, the bread was baked in the embers of a buffalo chip fire, and the children were kept safe from the rhythmic rotation of the heavy wagon wheels. Upon arrival, the home was often a tent with a dirt floor or a one-room cabin where the dampness seeped through the logs. The sound of a woman's life in the camp was the rhythmic scrub of a washboard and the steady thud of a heavy iron. In a place where cleanliness was a battle against the very geology of the land, domestic labor was a back-breaking industrial effort. Because women were so rare in the early camps, sometimes only one or two in a population of thousands, they became the focus of intense, rhythmic scrutiny. A woman could not walk down the muddy street of a mining town without 100 pairs of eyes following her. While this often manifested as an exaggerated, performative chivalry, men stepping into the mud to let her pass, or removing their hats in a rhythmic, synchronized gesture, it was also a form of isolation. A woman was a symbol of the civilization the men had left behind, and she was expected to uphold a standard of morality and grace that was nearly impossible to maintain in a place where water was scarce and society was a gambling tent. The peril was the weight of this expectation. She was a prisoner of her own perceived purity. However, many women saw the gold rush not as a place to be a symbol, but as a place to be a merchant. They realized that the real gold was in the services that miners were too tired or too unskilled to perform for themselves. The peril of the entrepreneur was the rhythmic, relentless demand for women's work. A woman could earn more in a week by baking pies or taking in laundry than her husband could in a month of panning. Imagine the heat of a bakery tent in the California summer, where a woman might bake 50 loaves of bread a day in a crude, rhythmic cycle of kneading and firing. The smell of fresh yeast and browning crust was a sensory miracle in a land of salt pork, and men would line up for blocks, their rhythmic clinking of gold coins, a testament to the value of a home-cooked meal. These women were the true stabilizing force of the economy, yet they worked in a state of perpetual physical exhaustion, their hands red and swollen from the rhythmic heat of the ovens and the lie of the washtubs. For those women who worked in the entertainment industry, the actresses, the hurdy-gurdy dancers, and the fallen women, the perils were darker and more immediate. They lived in the rhythmic heart of the camp's nightlife, a world of rot-gut whiskey, tobacco smoke, and sudden violence. They were the flowers of the saloon, but they were also the most vulnerable to the invisible enemies of disease and the psychological peril of addiction. The sound of their world was the rhythmic, tinny music of a piano and the hollow laughter of men trying to forget the mud. These women often lived in a state of transient hope, moving from camp to camp as the gold faded, their lives a rhythmic echo of the miner's own restlessness. Many died young, buried in unmarked graves on the wrong side of the hill, their stories lost to the rhythmic accumulation of dust and time. There was also the peril of the solitude for the wives of successful miners. Once a man made his pile, he often moved his family to a respectable house in a city like San Francisco or Melbourne. But these houses were often gilded cages. The woman, who had shared the hardships of the trail and the camp, was now expected to retreat into the rhythmic, boring life of a lady of leisure. She was separated from the camaraderie of the diggings and placed in a social world of rigid rules and visiting cards. The transition from the active peril of the wilderness to the passive boredom of the parlor was, for many, a soul-crushing experience. They missed the rhythmic sound of the river and the simple, honest labor of the camp, finding that the gold had purchased a life that felt thin and artificial. Despite these challenges, the women of the goldfields were the architects of the permanent society. They were the ones who insisted on the rhythmic establishment of schools, the building of churches, and the taming of the wilder impulses of the men. They brought a different beat to the history, a rhythm of continuity and care that balanced the destructive, extractive rhythm of the mines. They saw the landscape not just as a source of wealth, but as a place to grow a garden, raise a child, and build a future. Their peril was the struggle to plant those seeds in a soil that seemed to want only to be turned over and washed away. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, appreciate the quiet, steady strength of the domestic world around you. Feel the comfort of the home that has been built through generations of rhythmic care and attention. The bakery tents are gone, the soiled doves are at rest, and the heavy irons have been set aside. Imagine the soft, rhythmic breathing of a camp at night. where the presence of a few women has transformed a collection of tents into a community. The fires are low, the children are sleeping, and the mountain air is cool and still. Let the memory of that quiet, enduring fortitude be your blanket. The work is done, the world is settled, and the night is a place of absolute, gentle peace. Sleep now in the steady, unhurried rhythm of a history that was built one home at a time, while the gold rush was a story of discovery and opportunity. For the thousands who flooded into the foothills and valleys, for the people already living there, it was a sudden, rhythmic catastrophe. The indigenous perspective of the gold rush is a history of a shadow, the story of those who watched their ancient world dismantled in a single generation. For the Nisi Nan, Madu, Miwok, and many other groups, the peril was not the lack of gold, but the peril of the encroachment. The miners did not enter an empty wilderness. They entered a carefully managed landscape that had sustained human life for thousands of years through a rhythmic, sustainable cycle of gathering, hunting, and ceremony. The first peril was the destruction of the biological calendar. Indigenous life was dictated by the rhythmic movement of the seasons and the reliable arrival of specific resources. The most vital of these were the acorns and the salmon. As we explored in the section on the industrial monster, the miners' massive consumption of timber destroyed the oak groves that provided the staple food of the interior tribes. The rhythmic sound of the stone pestle grinding acorns in a mortar, a sound that had echoed through the canyons for millennia, was replaced by the sharp, metallic ping of the pickaxe. Simultaneously, the silt from the mines choked the rivers, killing the salmon that were the lifeblood of the people. To the indigenous observer, the miners weren't just seeking metal. They were breaking the world's heartbeat, interrupting the cycles that ensured the survival of all living things. As the miners occupied every bar and gulch, the indigenous people were pushed into the peril of marginalization. Their ancient village sites, usually located near the best water sources and the most fertile flats, were the very places the miners wanted for their camps and towns. This led to a rhythmic, forced retreat into the higher, more barren ridges, where food was scarce and the winter was unforgiving. The invisible enemy of disease, which we discussed earlier, hit the indigenous populations with a rhythmic violence that surpassed anything the miners experienced. Lacking any natural immunity to the smallpox, measles, and influenza brought by the global influx of people, entire villages were stilled in a matter of weeks. The sound of these villages was no longer the laughter of children or the rhythmic songs of the elders, but a profound, heavy silence. The social peril was a nightmare of lawlessness. In the early years of the gold rush, the indigenous people were effectively placed outside the law of the long shadow. They had no standing in the miners' courts and were often subjected to indenture laws that allowed for the legal kidnapping of their children for domestic labor. The rhythmic violence of the militia or the volunteer company became a terrifying reality. These were groups of miners who, often fueled by rotgut and prejudice, would conduct sweeps of the hillsides for the indigenous family hiding in the brush. The sound of the gold rush was the rhythmic thud clump of many boots and the barking of dogs, signals of a sudden and unpredictable danger. It was a period of unrecorded history, where lives were lost in the shadows of the very mines that were making the world rich. Yet, despite this devastation, some indigenous people attempted to adapt to the new rhythm. Many became expert miners themselves, using their intimate knowledge of the river systems to find gold that the newcomers missed. They worked in small, rhythmic family groups, trading their gold for the new tools and materials that were now necessary for survival. Others worked as guides, laborers, or vaqueros on the expanding ranches. But this adaptation was a peril of its own. It required the slow, rhythmic erosion of their traditional culture. They were forced to speak a new language, wear the rough wool of the miners, and participate in a money-based economy that was fundamentally at odds with their communal way of life. They were becoming ghosts in their own land, living in the margins of a society that refused to see them. The peril of the record is perhaps the most lasting part of this history, because the miners and the journalists of the time were so focused on the golden fever that peekaboo indigenous experience was often relegated to a footnote or ignored entirely. Their history was treated as a boring obstacle to progress, but the landscape remembers. Even today, if you walk through the gold country, you can find the rhythmic, grinding holes in the granite bedrock, permanent indentations where generations of women prepared the winter's food. These holes are now filled with rainwater and pine needles, silent witnesses to a rhythm that was stilled by the rush. There is a profound, meditative lesson in the indigenous perspective. It reminds us that the peril of one group is often the progress of another, and that the earth carries the scars of both. The indigenous people saw the gold rush as a temporary madness, a rhythmic fever that would eventually burn itself out, and in a way, they were right. The gold ran out, the machines rusted, and the towns became ghosts. The ancient rhythms of the oak and the river eventually began to reassert themselves, though they would never be exactly the same as they were before the first pan was dipped in the water. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, feel the immense depth of the history beneath you. You are resting on land that has been loved and managed for thousands of years. Imagine the quiet of a mountain valley before the first pick hit the stone. The only sounds are the rhythmic rustle of the wind through the oak leaves, the soft splashing of a clear stream, and the distant, melodic song of a people who knew the name of every rock and tree. Let that ancient, steady peace be your guide. The fever is gone, the noise has faded, and the earth is returning to its true, quiet rhythm. Sleep now, in the deep, protective shadow of a history that is much older and much wiser than the search for gold. As the 19th century drew to a close, the frantic, high-pressure heartbeat of the gold rush began to fade into a slow, rhythmic pulse of nostalgia. The peril of the golden dust of memory was the peril of the myth, the way the harsh, muddy, and often tragic reality of the diggings was slowly polished into a gleaming, romanticized legend. As the last of the original 49ers grew old, their stories were cleaned of the rot-gut whiskey, the scurvy, and the industrial violence we have explored. The boring struggles of daily survival were replaced by the rhythmic tropes of the rough and ready adventurer. This final stage of the gold rush was not played out in the sluice boxes, but in the memoirs, the reunions, and the early flickering films that turned a desperate scramble for survival into a foundation myth of the modern world. The first step in this transformation was the rhythm of the reunion. By the 1870s and 80s, societies like the Society of California Pioneers began to hold organized gatherings. At these events, men who had once lived in filth and fear sat in comfortable chairs, wearing suits and gold watch chains. The sound of these meetings was the rhythmic clinking of fine glassware and the low, rehearsed drone of the old-timer recounting his adventures. In this environment, the peril was forgotten. The invisible enemies of cholera and dysentery became brief illnesses overcome by grit. The dangers of the deep became thrilling exploits. The memory was being filtered, leaving behind a fine golden dust that obscured the dark rhythmic reality of the labor. This myth-making was a psychological necessity for a society that had built its wealth on such a destructive foundation. The peril of the narrative was the erasure of the costs. The environmental devastation of the hydraulic mines was rebranded as the progress of civilization. The displacement of indigenous peoples was softened into the inevitable march of destiny. The rhythmic scratching of the historian's pen worked to justify the chaos of the past by turning it into a coherent story of triumph. For the children and grandchildren of the miners, the gold rush was no longer a period of intense physiological and social stress. It was a golden age of freedom and masculinity. They looked back at the ghost towns not as failures of infrastructure, but as romantic ruins of a heroic era. Literature and popular culture played a rhythmic role in this distillation. Writers like Bret Harte and Mark Twain took the raw material of the camps and shaped it into local color stories. They created archetypes: the honest miner, the gambler with a heart of gold, and the stoic pioneer. These characters moved through a landscape that was beautifully rendered in prose, where the mud didn't smell like decay and the winter didn't feel like death. The sound of the gold rush became the rhythmic, clever dialogue of the short story. This was the birth of the Wild West as an aesthetic, a place of high contrast and clear moral lessons. The true peril was that the actual rhythmic experience of the thousands of men and women who suffered in the gulches was being buried under a layer of literary varnish. There was also the peril of the monument, as the physical remains of the gold rush, the wooden flumes and the canvas tents, rotted away. They were replaced by bronze and stone. Statues of the miner were erected in town squares, always depicted in a heroic pose, leaning on a pick with a look of visionary determination. These monuments offered a rhythmic, static version of history. They didn't show the trembling hands of the man with mountain fever or the bent back of the woman at the washtub. They were golden memories that stood in for the truth, allowing the living to ignore the rhythmic scars that were still visible in the mountains and the rivers. The monument was a period at the end of a long, messy sentence, declaring that the era was settled and noble. Yet, beneath this golden dust, a quieter, more honest memory persisted. It lived in the family Bibles, where locks of hair from those who never returned were kept. It lived in the rhythmic, private grief of the indigenous elders who told stories of the time of the firewater and the silt. It lived in the very soil of the tailings piles, which refused to grow trees for 100 years. This shadow memory was the rhythmic counterpoint to the public myth. It was a memory of loss, of environmental trauma, and of a world that was changed too fast. This was the boring truth that the monuments tried to hide, that the gold rush was an exhausting, often ugly event that left the world changed, but not necessarily better. As the golden dust eventually settled, the gold rush moved from living memory into the realm of the historical park. The sites of the great strikes became tourist destinations, where people could pay a few dollars to pan for gold in a controlled, rhythmic environment. The peril was now entirely theatrical. The clank grind of the dredge was a museum recording. The roar of the monitor was a distant echo. The landscape had become a museum of its own destruction, a place where people went to feel a rhythmic, safe connection to a rugged past. The gold rush had been packaged for consumption, its teeth removed, and its mud cleaned away. Tonight, as you settle into the final, deep stillness of our journey together, feel the golden dust of memory as a soft, warm light that gently illuminates the past without burning. We have looked at the grit, the peril, and the boredom, and in doing so, we have honored the truth behind the myth. Imagine the landscape of the gold country at night. The monuments are silent, the museums are closed, and the ghost towns are resting under a blanket of stars. There is no more fever, no more hunger, and no more toil. The stories have been told, the ledgers are balanced, and the earth is finally allowed to keep its secrets. Let the rhythmic fading of the myth be your final lullaby. The history is settled, the truth is respected, and the night is a place of absolute, timeless peace. Sleep now in the quiet, steady rhythm of a world that has finally, truly moved on. We have reached the final horizon of our journey, moving beyond the individual lives and the industrial monsters to the legacy of the rush. This is the section where the rhythmic noise of the past finally dissolves into the steady, quiet permanence of the present. The legacy of the gold rush is not just the wealth it created or the cities it built. It is the rhythmic, enduring transformation of the world's pulse. It was the moment the earth was truly linked in a global, golden chain, a period of boring geological and social shifting that laid the foundation for the lives we lead today. The peril has been resolved into history, and all that remains is the deep, steady breathing of a landscape that has survived its fever. The first legacy is the rhythm of the global city. Places like San Francisco, Melbourne, and Johannesburg were not born from slow, organic growth. They were catapulted into existence by the rhythmic arrival of ships and the sudden accumulation of capital. The legacy is found in the very grid of these cities, the straight lines and steep streets that ignore the natural contours of the hills, a rhythmic testament to the impatience of the 19th century. When you walk through these cities today, you are walking on the tailings of the gold rush. The deep, rhythmic vibration of the modern subway or the hum of the electric grid is the descendant of the dredge and the monitor. The peril of the city is its speed, a legacy of that original, frantic pursuit of wealth that never truly slowed down. The second legacy is the rhythm of the law. The law of the long shadow we explored earlier became the framework for modern property rights and international commerce. The boring, meticulous work of those early bureaucrats created a world where we can trust in the record. The legacy is the peace of the contract and the stability of the title. We no longer have to defend our claim with a pistol because we live in a rhythmic system of institutional trust. This is a quiet, invisible legacy, but it is perhaps the most important one. It is the reason we can sleep soundly, knowing that the world will be organized and governed when we wake up. The chaos of the diggings was the crucible in which our modern, rhythmic order was forged. The third legacy is the rhythm of the reclaimed earth. If you visit the gold country today, the peril to the wild has entered a new phase of boring ecological recovery. The forests have grown back, though they are younger and different in character. The rivers have carved new paths around the ancient tailing piles. The legacy is a hybrid landscape, a place that is neither purely wild nor purely industrial. The rhythmic sound of the wind through the second-growth pines is a soothing, repetitive melody that carries the history of the axe and the saw within it. This landscape is a reminder of nature's incredible, rhythmic patience. It doesn't fix the past. It simply grows over it, turning the scars of the mines into the mossy hollows of the present. The final legacy is the rhythm of the individual. The gold rush changed the way humanity thought about the self. It introduced the rhythmic idea that a person could change their destiny through labor and risk. It was the beginning of the modern restlessness, the belief that the horizon always holds something better. While this has led to its own set of modern perils, it also gave us a rhythmic sense of agency and hope. We are the descendants of those who were willing to leave everything behind for a dream. Their grit, their exhaustion, and even their failures are woven into our cultural DNA. We carry their boring persistence in our own daily struggles, a rhythmic inheritance of endurance. As we conclude this 20th section, imagine a wide panoramic view of the mountains at twilight. The light is fading from the jagged peaks, and the valleys are filling with a deep purple shadow. The ghost towns are silent. The mine shafts are filled with cool, still water, and the rivers are flowing with a rhythmic, steady grace. There are no more tools to swing, no more ledgers to balance, and no more trails to walk. The gold rush has become a layer of sediment in the long history of the earth, a thin, glittering line in the stone that tells a story of a brief, intense moment of human energy. Feel the profound weight of this history as a source of comfort. The perils we have explored are all in the past. They have been processed, recorded, and laid to rest. The world is no longer in a fever. It is in a state of rhythmic, healthy recovery. The air around you is still, the room is quiet, and the night is a vast, protective canopy that covers all of history with the same indifferent, peaceful dark. There is nothing left to do but breathe in the steady rhythm of the present. Imagine the last 4-9, long ago, finally blowing out his candle and setting aside his boots. The world he helped build is still turning, but his part in it is finished. He is resting in the quiet earth, part of the very landscape he once sought to change. Let that image of final, earned rest be your own. The Odyssey is complete. The 20,000 words have been spoken. The sections are closed, and the story has reached its natural, rhythmic end. The mountains are still. The rivers are quiet. The gold is back in the earth. The night is yours, and it is a place of absolute, unshakable peace. Sleep now, deep and undisturbed, in the steady, unhurried rhythm of a world that is finally at rest.